Hi everyone, welcome to the Restoring Rapport podcast. My name is Seth Hensley, and this is a show dedicated to young believers pursuing the goal of healthy marriage and family. You know, we live in a world where getting married and starting a family is far too often postponed for longer than God designed and pushed to the back burner in favor of less important things. But the good news is that it doesn't have to stay this way. As young believers, we have the choice to prioritize what matters most in our lives every day and to live face to face with God and others. Every Thursday and Sunday on this show, I'll be sharing research, conducting interviews, and reviewing articles on the importance of marriage and family for society. I'll also be releasing exclusive content such as spoken word poetry, allegorical short stories, and bonus episodes for subscribers. Friends, God did not set us up to live life alone. The truth of the matter is that every minute of your adult life that you wait to marry is a minute of your life that you're not spending with your life partner. While some might be content to live with the consequences of this arrangement, I would argue that those who wish to spend as much of their life as possible with their mate are perfectly within reason and soundness of value to do so. It is my deepest hope that this podcast inspires Generation Z to pursue marriage, become the best spouses and parents the world has ever seen, serve with furious intentionality, love well, and discover the joy of hanging the moon for another. To access my sources, subscribe to the show, or get your copy of my latest book, visit anchor.fm/Seth-Hensley, or check out the show notes of each episode.
All right, guys. Well, welcome back to the podcast. I am excited to be joined today by Ryan Mayfield, Seth Hensley, and Jon Putnam. Thank you guys for joining me today.
Excited.
Yeah. So, I as a habit like to say things online that I'm wrestling with, thinking through, posting things that are resonating with me. And there was an article that was published recently about whether or not Jesus and the apostles were trying to found a new religion. And the author was sort of unpacking that and to sort of giving historical ideas there that to me really seemed consistent with a lot of what I've heard. But he was also sort of dropping various theological implications that were quite controversial, most of which I didn't agree with. But I wanted to kind of talk through that claim, the historic claim in particular, and then its theological implications, because it started such an interesting discussion online. So I wrote a little bit about my thoughts about that article, and we will do our best to link it. It's also my article is on my Substack, and I also link to the original article. So if you guys are looking for that, jump on my Substack, Jeremy Pryor's podcast. I'm reading from the article. Were Jesus and the apostles attempting to found a brand new religion? So I'm going to read this and then get my friends' feedback on this. So yesterday, I reshared a post on Facebook that a friend shared, linking to an article that sounds like it could use more reflection. So here's the post. After Jesus, before Christianity. It says, neither Jesus nor Paul nor Peter ever intended to start a new religion. They began a universalist, non-religious Jewish movement that welcomed Gentiles and had none of the elements of a religion you find today or in the first century. A temple, synagogue, or church system, sacrifices, priests, professional pastors or ministers, a church institution, a church/denominational hierarchy, and a boatload of religious rituals or codes of conduct, end quote. So this stirred up some discussion in the comments that I'd like to follow up on in my preferred manner, an informal podcast conversation. So that's what we're having today. But here's my take on the article. The author made a number of historical claims that I found consistent with my research into first century history, but he added several theological claims he suggested necessarily flow from the history, most of which I disagree with. So to those who want to discuss his theological conclusions like, quote, love for God and equitable love for your neighbor is all that is necessary, according to Jesus and later Paul. I'm not in agreement with the author on that point, but the point of the article was a summary of historical claims that sound like the consensus among historians. These points do raise some challenging theological questions, and I've long guessed that this is why the history is so little known or discussed among today's Christians. That's why I reshared the post. Now, let me admit that I'm not a historian. I love history. I've studied the first and second century history as a particular period of interest, but I'm always up for having my views corrected by those closer to the primary source material. So several of you asked that I lay out my current understanding regarding the author's points. I'll schedule a time for us to have a podcast. That's today. For any of us who would like to dive further, as we should all attempt to reach a better understanding of these facts of history. So here are the 5 points he made and some thoughts on each. So number one, he says, when the original Jesus movement began and grew, it was not a new religion. I agree. It was a part of Judaism. Jesus was claimed to be the Jewish Messiah, and had that claim been accepted, what we know of as Christianity, as a mostly Western non-Jewish faith, would have looked entirely different. From the resurrection through the book of Acts, Paul would begin his ministry to each city, making his case in Jewish synagogues, and move toward Gentiles after the Jewish community from each city rejected these messianic claims. That's why he constantly saying things like first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. You can especially see this theme in the non-Pauline epistles, where James even describes that the regular gathering of believers happened in a synagogue. That's in James 2:2. Even though a Greek word synagogue is used, it's hidden by most translations. All right, his second point, the quote way they taught was not technically a religious way. Okay, now this depends on how you define the word religious. The author of the article seems to be defining the word as a system of ethics, dietary, cleanliness codes that make a small percentage of people as a part of an elite group of insiders. So if that's the definition, then yes, Jesus was teaching an almost anti-religion. But there are many ways to define religion that would fit what Jesus and Paul taught. I don't like to get bogged down in semantics, but feel the substance of his historical argument that this teaching was perceived as an anti-religion within the first century is a credible claim. His use of the word universalism and his theological conclusion in this paragraph does not describe what I think Jesus was teaching. The New Testament was making exclusive claims about those who believe in Jesus, and because Jesus kept the Torah perfectly, those who were in Christ, including Gentiles, were invited in. But one must still believe in Jesus and confess that he is Lord. This still makes insiders and outsiders, while making it possible to invite everyone in. Only in that sense is it universal. 3, he says, true Judaism, per the original Jesus movement, was to be a way of life based on love. That's true. Jesus was working to make Judaism center more on love. Quote, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Those are the 2 commandments to love God and love your neighbor. But more importantly, he was opening a way for this love to flow from the inside out. The author seems to possibly miss this point, and whenever we emphasize love without the necessity for exclusive faith commitments and the power of the Holy Spirit, humans return back to the center of the faith. They become the center of the faith, following whatever their culture tends to define as love instead of how Jesus defined it. Number 4, individual groups of followers were not generally called Christians. Okay, sure, there were decades in the first century where this was true. His larger point is important. Our modern use of the words Christian and Christianity tends to cause us to read back into the text the idea that Jesus and the apostles were trying to found a brand new religion. What that means about what we should call ourselves today, though, is a different question. Labels tend to be created by others, and when they stick for a reason. So we can get deeper into that if we'd like. Number 5, he says, this is why the Romans called the first Jewish communities atheists or godless ones. Okay, that is historically accurate from my reading. So what I like least about the article, and what I hope to avoid in our podcast discussion, is moving from history to theology and back without acknowledging it. We can agree about history, disagree about how that impacts theology. Why does this matter? I've long wondered if Jesus was not trying to found a new religion, then much more ought to be done to bring Judaism and Christianity closer together. Excited to discuss? Okay, so those are my thoughts. I know you guys have had a chance to take a look at those. And so I'd love to go around. Maybe we start with you, Ryan, and then go to Jon and then Seth. Give me kind of your overall take, and then we'll kind of start the discussion.
Yeah, well, I mean, first off, I love any article that almost upsets people, just because it pushes the bounds on stuff and makes people actually think about stuff like that. For me, I have a little bit of a unique experience. Maybe I lived for several years in South Asia in a non-Christian culture, and just getting to know people there and talk about Jesus and faith in that context has really put a lot of this in a different light to me. And so, the idea of religion, I think one thing that in the West we think about with religion is religion has to do with what you believe about God. And what I have found in other cultures is that those different things that we call religions are much more close to what we would call cultures here, right? It's not just about what you believe, but it's about what you do and the holidays you celebrate and the foods that you eat and don't eat and all of those different things. And so it's just interesting because it's so fluid here. Like you can go from this religion to that religion or, whatever you want. But in most parts of the world, it seems like you are that religion because you are born that religion, right? And so when I think about this article, what I think about is where Jesus and Paul both, are advocating that it's open to everybody, that Jesus is for everyone, that he's not for a specific religion, but that all people can come to him, right? So that's some of my initial.
In that sense, are you then saying that it is Jesus and Paul were advocating for this kind of anti-religion, like because because it's now not an exclusive claim? So on one hand, and this is where the semantics do get kind of complicated. You're saying that religion, in most of the world, they see it as a culture. It's really the total of all the values that our culture holds. And so the idea that it's sort of this thing that you can segment into, I have some kind of intellectual opinion about the afterlife or about who God is. That sort of idea of religion that's popular in the West is totally mystifying to people in the East. To them, it's just this is what's true. This is the true story we're living in, and therefore it implicates everything. So that's more how they define religion. But then when Jesus and Paul were advocating for something, I think what I'm sort of trying to understand is it nested within Judaism? So Judaism itself gives us this this culture, this hierarchy of values, this idea of how to see life, and then they were layering, like within that or nested inside of that, a particular messianic claim about Jesus and the inside out nature of the kingdom on this side of the cross, without trying to basically differentiate Judaism from Christianity. That's kind of what I'm trying to wrestle with. Do you have any thoughts about, given the fact that, in the East, religion is seen differently, how would you think about that idea?
About it being just
an nested inside of Judaism.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, Jesus was Jewish. His first followers were Jewish. And I think that you can be Jewish and follow Jesus. Like, I mean, Jesus was Jewish, right? But you also see through Jesus and Paul them opening the door to non-Jews to follow Jesus as well, without having to become Jews themselves, right? The Jerusalem Council is a really big thing in that, Acts 15. And so the door is open for both, is what I'm saying.
Got it. Awesome. Well, that's a good segue for you, Jon, because I know that you've thought about it from that perspective, the Jerusalem Council. So talk to me a little bit about, how do you react to this sort of idea, and any thoughts you've had about this?
Well, I think that the question of whether this is a new religion, I think, as you said in your remarks, I thought they were actually really good on a number of fronts. One of them is, how do you define religion? But I also think maybe even more fundamentally is, or at least to amplify that, who are you defining it for? Because I think from the point of view of a Gentile, Gentiles weren't welcome within Judaism. And so the preaching the gospel to the Gentiles was something that it opened a door that was previously closed to them. I mean, there was no kind of access to God, we were having no hope and without God in the world. And so I would say in that sense, it was new to Gentiles, and it's hard to argue that it wasn't. I think one of the reasons it was new to Gentiles was because the Jews perceived themselves as having their own religion. They were God's people, but they didn't perceive themselves as being a light to the Gentiles.
Right.
And I think that this is one of the tragedies of human nature. I mean, I think if I'd been a Jew, I would have been the same way. But I think that ultimately what God wanted to do was to use the Jews' acceptance of the Messiah to preach the gospel to the nations, and instead, the second best plan was to use the Jews' rejection of the Messiah to preach the gospel to the nations. So it seems to me that from the point of view of the Jews, the gospel is the fulfillment of the promises to the fathers, and one of which is to preach the gospel to the nations. And from the point of view of the Gentiles, it was finally the actuating that promise in a way that it had never been actuated previously, and in some ways kind of an ironic and almost tragic fashion. But so I guess I answered the question: was it a new religion? As it sort of like depends on who you're talking about.
So it almost sounds like you're saying, okay, for a Gentile, because this was not accessible to them, it's maybe more accurate to call this a new religion from their perspective. For a Jew who's just receiving the messianic claims of Jesus and becoming an adherent to Jesus as Lord and as Messiah, it probably is less accurate to call this a new religion.
Well, I mean, it certainly was radical. I mean, that's why Jesus got killed. But there were people who were trying to come to grips with, what are you really saying? What about the law? What about all these things that we actually know? Are you abolishing the law? And Jesus says, no, I'm fulfilling the law, but I'm fulfilling it in such a way that seems so different that you're gonna have to kind of like get your mind blown about what you think your religion is in order to accept me. And so for some people, he could say it wasn't a new religion, but from their perspective, it might as well be, because it required an entire rethinking of everything they had been taught, not so much by God, but by their own culture and their elders.
Okay. So even for a Jew, because it was such a radical rethinking of how to sort of look at their faith, that it could be argued that he was that a first century Jewish person that's hearing the gospel is going to see this as a conversion to a new religion. I mean, would you say that that's how you read it, or how you would likely think they would perceive it?
I don't know if I would call it a conversion. I would say, but I mean, you see Nicodemus, struggling with this, when Jesus says, you must be born again. What does that even mean? And so I don't know. It sort of like becomes semantic, whether was Jesus preaching a new religion to Nicodemus, or the true version of the old religion, which Nicodemus couldn't fathom.
It seems like
which required being born again.
Yeah.
Once you get past that.
Which do you think is probably more likely then? That maybe it is a new way to see an old religion? Like that's kind of what resonates with me, because I think that Jesus's whole argument, even using the snake in the wilderness as an example to Nicodemus, was suggesting that the thread of everything he was teaching existed within Judaism, and that Jesus was really upset about sort of the Pharisaic interpretation of the Torah, right? That they were misapprehending basic. Now there were things that were shifting, but they weren't as. If you go from sort of Pharisaism, or the sort of the Pharisaic interpretation of the Torah, to Jesus' interpretation of the Torah, then maybe it's more fair to say that's a radical leap. But if you were to go from what they were advocating as the true interpretation of the Torah to what Jesus was saying, it doesn't seem like a new religion to me. At that point, it starts to feel like a sort of a continuation on the same theme.
I totally agree. I think he was, he was, when you look at the way Jesus dealt with adultery and circumcision, from the beginning, it was not this way. Divorce, he was appealing to the continuity of the way God had dealt with his people. And he was trying to get people to understand that they were it's like Reagan said about the Democratic Party. I didn't leave them, they left me. It's sort of like God saying the same thing. I haven't changed. You're the ones that have changed. And now this seems radical, but it's not radical.
Yes. Okay. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, cool. Seth, I want you to chime in here. Give us your take on this question and how you're thinking through this.
For sure. I just want to, preface anything that I say here with just a little caveat that I am by far the most inexperienced here, and I've done the least amount of work, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. But my thoughts on it, I think, were summarized pretty well by something that a man named Brad Gruber commented on your original link on Facebook, and he said, "Doesn't all this first require defining the word religion?" And I think defining terms is really important when you're getting into an argument on a theological debate or anything really. But religion can mean, yes, a set of liturgical traditions and structures that are man-made, but it can also mean I think a lot of people have the connotation of religion being something about your relationship with God.
Yeah.
And I think the original author, needed to do a little bit better defining his terms there. Right. Because like we were talking about at the beginning, I think you guys mentioned defining terms too, but I think that's really important. And I also see the distinction Mr. Pryor has made so well in his first point, being that Christianity, following Jesus, and Judaism, are inextricably linked, and that Judaism was the foundation that Jesus built off of when he was beginning his public ministry. But I also think it's important to note that for me, the distinction becomes Judaism does not acknowledge Jesus as the Messiah, the fulfillment of all those prophecies, whereas Christianity does. So I think in that sense, it is something very different and something very new. And Jesus did say a lot of things that did go against the current Jewish teaching of the day. So he was not, in a sense, I guess he wasn't starting from scratch, but he was changing the way people viewed the Old Testament scriptures. For example, the Sabbath was not made for man; man was made for the Sabbath. People said, they even came up with additional laws. I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you guys know more about this than me, but I believe they even came up with additional rules, like 316 of them or so, and said, you have to follow these in order to observe the law. And, Jesus began correcting those, and he did so from the place of authority as God. So I think Jesus was, I would say, starting a new religion, if you believe religion is the worship of the Creator.
Right.
Because he was claiming to be God, whereas Judaism does not acknowledge that. But I do think he built off of the foundation of Judaism, and he took many things from that in his teaching. Obviously, I mean, as Ryan pointed out, he was Jewish.
Right.
So those are my thoughts initially, Jeremy. But I think this is a wonderful article. I really appreciate it. And again, like Mr. John said, it was affronting. The title, and Ryan, you said the same. You liked reading articles that were affronting initially on Facebook. It stuck out to me. I said, whoa, I gotta look into this. And I was excited to be on this for sure. So thank you for inviting me. But yeah, those are my initial thoughts, Jeremy.
Yeah. And maybe we could, that's really helpful, Seth. Thank you for sharing that. And it's Dr. John. So
Dr. John.
We need to refer to him that.
Oh, wow.
And
Grandpa Jeremy. Okay. Grandpa Jeremy and Dr. John. So that's right.
Jeremy, Dr.
right.
John. Dr. John.
That's awesome. So I think part of the thing that I'm really interested in trying to understand is that I think because there's sort of a consensus that we've been spinning around, which is there's a fundamental continuity between Judaism and Christianity, such that there's that has been somehow obfuscate throughout history, the history of the Christian church. And I think that part of it is very near and dear to, I would say, my my critique of sort of modern assumptions and theologies and practices of Christianity. It's so not Jewish, so not Hebraic, because I think that there has been a perception that Jesus was starting an essentially Western religion, to the point that when you're in Jerusalem talking to Jews, you can't imagine the distance that they feel from Christianity. They look at a single Catholic priest walking down the street, and they see that as really representing Christianity, where the father pushing his stroller with all of his kids on their way to Sabbath prayers. Like, these could not be more different religions. And it seems like we've done something to to make that perception really deep within the way that people perceive our faith, that these are very, very, very distinct. And so his basic point that using words like Christianity and Christian tend to, if not really thought out, really reinforce this idea that these are completely separate religions, and that they aren't really tied together. And so I'm trying to understand if the first century there was a very deep sense of continuity. By the 4th century, there was this completely discontinuous idea between Judaism and Christianity. Do we want to build from 4th century assumptions or from 1st century assumptions? What does it look like to actually try to get back to, can we repudiate some of the things that happened in the 4th century that contributed to this distance? Or should we just say, look, it happened, history is history, and it's important for us to continue to build on some of those assumptions. That's what I'm wrestling with. I don't know if that stirs up anything for you guys, but that's what I'm really trying to understand. Ryan, do you have any thoughts on that? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I have a lot of thoughts on that, probably too many for the podcast. I think it's funny. I agree with everything you just said. And to answer your question, just first off, is I'm solidly in the camp of build off of that 1st century understanding. For me, there's just so much other stuff that gets attached, and it just compounds and snowballs, right? To the point of where we get to today, where, and I mean, this may be a hot take, but there's a lot of church communities in the West that Jesus can be really hard to find in the middle of it. And the irony in some of the things you said about Judaism and Christianity being so different is that a lot of modern versions of both are both so steeped in the law, and neither one of them is terribly focused on Jesus as Messiah. And so it's funny because I'll look at American Christianity and think that in a lot of ways it does look like Judaism, not the same laws, but that we have gotten so wrapped up in some of the do's and the don'ts, right? Our own version of the law. Like, I mean, every church, that I think I was in growing up was, they talked about the 10 commandments, like, right. And you should do this and you shouldn't do that. And all these things. And so it's like, we almost have our own Christian version of the Jewish law, which isn't any better than having a Jewish version and missing Jesus.
Yes. That's a fascinating irony that you're describing, that we've peeled away so far from Judaism that we've sort of recircled around and are beginning to form our own Torah observant culture, but completely based on 4th century and not 1st century assumptions about the faith. That's really good. Yeah, that makes sense. And I agree. That's a challenging reality. Jon, what does this turn up for you? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have, I guess I sort of feel like, as a matter of fact, and also as a matter of philosophy, I'm a Gentile. And I love reading the Old Testament, and I love reading about God's dealings with his people, but I can't honestly represent myself as being as a quote unquote 1st century person. Like I'm not steeped in the law. I don't, the Jerusalem Council was actually I look at that and I go like, okay, here's where I come in. What do I have to do? Well, don't strangle animals. Okay, check. Don't sleep with your mother. So far, so good. Yeah. And there's a couple others, and so I and that's, and I feel like it's hard to be anything other than what I am, which is a person who is kind of entering the God story at that point in time. That doesn't mean, however, that I think you actually made a useful distinction, which is between 1st century Christianity and 4th century. And I think, getting back to Ryan's point, that's kind of a historical way of saying the same thing he was saying, which is that people have religious hearts divorced from God. I mean, in other words, if you think of religion as being in its etymology of people trying to relink themselves to God, we have to get ourselves back to the garden, like Joni Mitchell said, which is completely impossible. The Jews were trying to get themselves back to the garden in one way, and the Gentiles were trying to get themselves back to a garden in a different way. And it's all kind of, the same leaven is leavening 2 very different loaves of bread, but it's still crap and it still needs to be reformed. So in saying that I'm not a Jew is not to say that therefore I am a 4th century Gentile, and I really think that the Western civilization and everything that came after the Holy Roman Empire and the church and all that sort of stuff, I think that's just a Western version of the perversion that Pharisaism was. And I think, just as an aside, I actually think that this was the real point of the author. He made a bunch of points that I didn't agree with, but I think what he was trying to say was, the core of what he was trying to say was Jesus didn't start something that looks like American Christianity today. It doesn't have a lot of the accoutrements and everything like that, and the rules, like Ryan said. And this is a common critique, is like how Jesus didn't die for what the little Baptist church on the corner. And I think that's fair. He didn't die for a cathedral and a stone building and rules and a different set of laws. And that was sort of the opening critique. And I think he made a lot of other points. But fundamentally, what he wants to do is sort of strip away some of the things that crept into the church that were certainly evident by the 4th century. And I'm at least somewhat sympathetic to that. Just the way Jesus was,
Yeah.
Yes, a lot of these things you strain out, you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and you forget the important points.
Well, so it sounds like if I were to, what I hear you saying is you identify as a 1st century Gentile. like the 1st century, you can be a 1st century Jew, a 1st century Gentile in terms of like the foundation from which you derive your core beliefs and values. Paul was articulating what a 1st century Gentile would have to, like, you don't have to become a Jew. You don't have to become a 1st century Jew. Now there's a 4th century Gentile, which is somebody who might have almost as their foundation, like their root structure might be actually deeply embedded within sort of Roman pagan religion. And then they're trying to find a way to sort of combine that or syncretize that in some way with the Christian faith. So maybe not identifying with that root structure. And I think that what I've really wrestled with, because I really like kind of that idea that you're describing, Jon, is that like if you did exist in the 1st century, Paul was trying to make a very strong case, and the Jerusalem Council was trying to advocate for the idea that a Gentile does not have to become ethnically Jewish, does not have to somehow re-enter back and sort of do away with their own identity in order for them to come to faith. I think the thing that I wrestle a lot with is, between Genesis 1 through 3, and then skipping all the way to Jesus, in terms of the story arc of what I think often Gentile Christianity looks like. Was that what Paul was advocating for? How much time should a 1st century Gentile spend marinating in the Torah? Like, when Paul says all scripture is God breathed and is useful for teaching and correcting and training in righteousness, he seemed to be talking about the Hebrew scriptures centered on the Torah. And so I wonder whether or not to come into faith, he's saying for sure you're not giving up your Gentile heritage, your own ethnic identity, but look, you're joining a movement of God that's been going on for thousands of years, and you have a lot of catching up to do. And by the way, all of this Toraic stuff is all about Jesus, right? The Passover lamb is about Jesus. The first fruits is about Jesus. As you're going through the Torah, you're definitely learning and interpreting the Psalms and the prophets and the Torah through the lens of Jesus. But I think that part of what has occurred, well, by the way, I think that reality then makes Jewish people more very useful as teachers to 1st century Gentile Christians, and that's, I think, what was happening in a lot of cases. People were becoming elders after being believers for a pretty short period of time because they were already likely Jewish, fathers who were practicing, their Toraic faith. And when they brought the messianic sort of adherence to that and their allegiance to Jesus and started to reinterpret that, it wasn't like they were starting from scratch, right? They were things like light bulbs were going on, but like all of the sort of the root structure that was in their mind, in their hearts, was all still, very relevant to their faith in Jesus. So that's the line that I'm trying to play around with as you're describing this, Jon, is like, how much should a 1st century Gentile discipleship look like? Basically, like getting a major lesson in the fullness of the Old Testament or the Hebrew scriptures. Any thoughts about like how far? Because those 3 things that James was advocating for in Acts 15 that you mentioned, was that to sort of limit the amount of that, or was that just a sort of to me, he was mostly attempting to try to figure out if the Gentiles and Jews are going to come together, and Jews are going to continue to keep all the Torah kosher, especially the dietary laws, what are we going to require the Gentiles to do in deference to their Jewish brothers? And that seems like that maybe the part of the decision he's making, but I still don't think, I think that leaves open the question, how much should we immerse Gentile Christians into the Hebrew scriptures as their root structure for belief? At that point, then it becomes very much, it starts to feel like one faith as opposed to now a separate one. Any thoughts? Any you guys can chime in.
Well, I would jump in, but I actually want to give everybody a chance to talk. So I'm going to put in a placeholder and say I'd love to answer that question, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Cool. Yeah, Seth, is that stirring anything up for you? Anything that you would like to chime in on that point?
Yeah, sure. I think you are, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeremy, but you're trying to say it bothers you to say and to think that Jesus was coming to create what is modern Christianity today. And instead, he was actually building from a pre-existing chosen people. Is that what you're saying? And that we should, even believers today, should be very aware of the culture that Christianity was built from. And I totally agree with that. I think that's brilliant. Especially because, like you said, if not, the alternative is missing out on thousands of years of rich culture, and not only rich culture, but culture that Jesus came from. And he chose to come from that religion, right? I mean, he could have he could have been born anywhere and taught from anywhere, but I think he chose to come into Israel, right? And I think that says something about just history, even from a historical perspective. I think there's value in educate as well. I know you practice the feasts regularly, and you have you guys do Jewish feasts as a family together. I think that's brilliant. There's just a lot of rich culture there. Where I think the original article by Michael Camp appeals to me is because he was arguing that, like Jeremy said, modern day Christianity, how we do it today, modern liturgical practice is not what the early church was. That's what I am super passionate about and agree with through, the work of Frank Viola, George Barna. He wrote a book called Pagan Christianity. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that and have read that. That really opened my eyes in the sense of how much our modern day Christianity, our modern worship practice has been influenced by pagan Roman cultures, other cultures in the world. And it's just something to be aware of. I don't think what we practice today is what Jesus established. I think Jesus was building off of that Jewish foundation. And yes, he was saying new things. There is a distinction between Judaism and Christianity that I would never want to get rid of. Correct me if I'm wrong, gentlemen, but I do believe Jews believe that Jesus is not the Messiah, that he was a prophet, a good teacher, that kind of thing. Is that right?
Yeah, he's not modern day Orthodox Judaism definitely doesn't hold to his messianic claims. Yeah.
So I think there's a distinction, but I do believe that there is something to be said for the fact that Jesus came to the Jews.
Yeah.
And that Jesus built from Jewish culture and taught from Jewish culture. And yes, corrected Jewish culture, but also taught from it.
Yeah. And I'm wondering, Ryan, how this hits you in terms of the whole idea that, let's say, I mean, to me, given your original comments about like the definition of religion being a culture, it feels like, and it also sort of a reflection of just the reality that as Christians, it seems like we should believe there only ever has been one religion. Like there's only one true culture. There's only one faith. There's only one God. There's only one truth. There's not like multiple truths. And so you basically have one truth and lots of false ideas, false religions. And this is part of where this is a little bit tricky today to parse out, in that like we believe Jews definitely follow the one true God, but their refusal to acknowledge the messianic claims of Jesus and be impacted by his teachings, and then how they've been interpreted by Paul and James and Peter and others. This has caused them to sort of be sort of stuck in the past, but not to say that what they believed originally was was not true and wasn't rooted in that one truth. And now, of course, you have the reinterpretation of Judaism based on the fact that the temple was destroyed, and so a lot has happened and to change the nature of Judaism over the last 2,000 years since Jesus. But especially getting back to the first century Jewish followers of God, of Yahweh, they were following the one true faith. And so I think given that there's just so much continuity there that has been lost somehow. And I think that's a lot of what I'm spinning around trying to figure out, if we didn't have the enormous amount of anti-Semitism that happened in the 4th century, what would the faith look like today? There's a lot of sort of unpacking to do.
Yeah, I think so. Just on that, when we talk about the word religion, I mean, to your point, there's been different definitions and everything of it, but also the idea of like one true culture, or however you want to, say that. I would agree, but, and I don't mean this in an offensive way, I don't think that equates to Judaism, because Judaism isn't on page 1 of Scripture. right? That doesn't happen till later. And there are plenty of people pre-Judaism in scripture who are known as people of faith, right? And people outside of the Jewish system, like Melchizedek, right, is one that is called that way. And so there exists this minority outside of the Jewish family in scripture that seem to be in the family of God. Now that doesn't take away from the fact that God obviously has a special place for Israel and for the Jewish line. But I don't think there is like this one monoculture, because in the end of scripture in Revelation, we see the culmination of all things. And it says, gathered around the throne were people from every tribe, tongue, language, and culture, right? Like there's diversity that is God designed and God ordained, but they all are connected back to some, original truth, original creation. And I think that you can find that truth through a lot of different cultures.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. Yeah, that's really interesting. And it kind of reminds me of what, John, the point you were making. And like, I think that there seems to be what you just said, Ryan, and I want, John, your thoughts on this. You can go too far in a way that annihilates your own ethnic, cultural values. So if you believe, let's say, that religion is a total culture, then we all should be Jewish at some level. And we all, and basically that should annihilate the sort of ethnic distinctions that different cultures do value, these sort of peripheral values differently, that and rank them differently. And it gives rise to sort of this beautiful multicultural thing that you see in the book of Revelation that, Ryan, you're referring to, where every tribe and tongue and nation. And so yeah, John, where would you draw that line? Is there somewhere you're sensing like, okay, there's a point at which, this line of thinking kind of goes too far and starts to eliminate and diminish the multiculturalism that God has initiated from basically, I guess, Genesis 11?
Well, that's actually wouldn't be my concern. My concern would be, it's not like, I'm Scottish and I insist on the right to be Scottish, I'm cheap, or something like that, I will wear skirts, and they will have wool and cotton in them.
They will be there in heaven. Yes. Bagpipes in heaven.
Bagpipes. Exactly. I know. So I wouldn't say that, I have a right to my, you're not your own. You were bought with a price. I've been crucified with Christ, so claiming to be Scottish or something like that, it seems like stupid. It seems but the flip side of that is claiming to be Jewish also seems to be stupid, because I don't want to feel like I'm living my whole life as a fake. Like, how can I possibly be as Jewish as a Jewish person? No, I'm never going to do that. And if that was the objective, then I'm going to fail. And I don't feel like Jesus called me to that either. He didn't call me to claim my rights as a Scotsman, but he didn't call me to imitate a Jew. And so I don't want to, the way I think of it, and then I wrote to you this when you asked about the podcast, was Paul says that compares us to a new branch that's been grafted onto an old root, and so then the question becomes, is that a new tree? Well, it depends what you mean by new. It depends what you mean by tree, Yeah. So the way I would think of it as one who was clearly grafted on is, I'm supposed to bear the fruit that I was designed to bear at the tips, but every juice that I have, everything flowing through my veins, came from the root, not from me. And so it would be foolish to pretend that I have any link to life other than through the root. So I had better understand what the root is doing through me, even though I'm bearing a different fruit than the original branch would have borne. And that's just, so I'm a mixture.
What is that? What is that root? What are you saying there about what?
Well, so this is, that's actually, so where I would go with this is to say, I think I'm supposed to be I'll answer that question. I think fundamentally I'm supposed to manifest life. I ordained that you would bear much fruit that would last. So that means that whatever comes out of me has to be life. And the problem with trying to understand this, and I think about this all the time, is, for me, how does that sanctification process, the process of actually getting fruit to come out, how does that work? And in particular, what is the relationship of the law to that sanctification process? Mm-hmm. So I think one of your questions is when we say Judaism, an awful lot of what we're talking about is really the prescripts of the law And I think the law is a beautiful thing, but the law, is perfect, but it makes nothing perfect. It can't sanctify me. So I can understand the law, but as soon as I start to try to obey the law or keep the law, I'm going to fail. So what I'm trying to do is allow this, Jesus said, my words are spirit and they are life. That by itself was a radical statement for a Jew to say about the law. People I don't think really thought of it that way. They thought of it as rules. And Jesus said, no, it's life. So as a branch grafted on, I'm trying to let the juices from the root flow through me. And that means being informed by the law and learning about who God is by the law, but recognizing that unless I see this as a form of life flowing through me, I will never bear fruit. And if you ask me how to do that, I'm trying to teach my kids this. It's life. It's not about rules. It's about life. Learn what God did. Learn why he promulgated those rules, but don't try to follow them.
Yes.
All that they say, do and observe, but do not be like them. And that's really, for me, struggling as a Gentile grafted onto the Jewish branches. How do I let that life flow through me and not become a legalist?
Right. So the root is, you're saying, it is the sort of the Hebrew scripture, because even what you were saying, Ryan, about like there were believers, there were God followers like Melchizedek before Abraham, and Isaac. We're still reading a Hebrew story that started before Abraham, but it's being told, and that nourishment. And then this is part of the challenge, or the thing that I'm trying to wrestle with what you're saying, John, because I think on one hand you have, you can say that's the Hebrew scriptures, that's the whole life of, of the history of Israel, that seems like Paul is really sort of describing the root. And then Jesus, of course, but he says in John 15, I am the vine, you are the branches. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The way sounds like a almost a reference to the Torah, which is another way of saying the Torah is the way, the teaching, the law. The law is a little bit of a constricted way of describing it, but it's certainly more than just a law. And I think that's maybe where a lot of the tension is when people emphasize more like, okay, the root is Jesus. Jesus is what we Christians have thought he was from the 4th century on. And then all of this, sort of the root structure that, it seems like Paul's arguing for, Romans 11, kind of falls out of the story somehow. And now we're building a new tree, and Jews, you should join us, like you're brand new, as opposed to being grafted into your own. And this is Paul's argument. Like, be really, really careful. There's a sense in which there's an honoring that needs to take place. And I think it's the dishonoring of that pre-existing root structure that I think maybe, I'm increasingly sensitive to. And that I think that offends God, as well as, people that do come from that root structure. And so, but to do that in a way that doesn't dishonor, what the Gentiles are trying to do and follow Jesus, so I don't know if that's stirring up for anything. Any last comments you guys want to make as we're kind of just processing? This is really helpful to kind of think through. Yeah, Ryan,
I think Dr. Putnam, his example there of being grafted on to an old root, I think that was really good, because what's the alternative? Are we grafted on? What's our foundation that we're building this house called Christianity on? Is it on, postmodern Christianity? Is it on modern Christian thought? I definitely think that's wrong. I think Judaism was the foundation that Christ then built from, and I think it's important for it to stay that way. And as such, as a foundation, I think it should have our respect and our honor, like Mr. Pryor said. I think that's an important thing to have in modern culture, is a respect for our foundation as believers.
Yeah, that's good. Good, Ryan. Any last thoughts from you?
Yeah, just the word foundation has been thrown around quite a bit, and I think that's a really good concept to have in this conversation, because, like, if you could build a house, right, with a small foundation, and it will stand up probably, right? But the deeper the foundation is, the stronger, the house is tethered to something. And so when you talk about modern expressions of faith, I think one of the things that this is bringing up in me is that there's so many modern expressions of faith in Jesus, which usually take the form of Christianity, that are built on a very small foundation that does not include the root structure that you guys are talking about. And so it's untethered.
Yes.
And that means it can get it right, but it's easily knocked over.
Yes.
And so
Well
I
said.
think we have to, differentiate between requirement versus wisdom.
Wow.
There
That's
is no requirement to, to memorize the Torah and do all of the things that a faithful Jew would do, but there's a lot of wisdom to be found in it.
Yes.
And so I think that's just an important piece, kind of maybe a nuance in that. It's not a new religion, but there's value in the old for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really well said. The wisdom. I think Jesus says something like, the teachers of the law are like, what does he say? They're like, they're bringing out of their storehouse both like old treasures
Old
and new. Yeah. It's like just, like there's an obsession today of new treasure, and there's a real neglect of old. And I think you're using the foundation analogy. That's really well said. That part of this is just wisdom. We don't want this thing to blow over because we're inventing things left and right, and every generation and every church invents new traditions, and then before you know it, they're just toppling over left and right. We need some depth to what we're doing. Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
John, any of the last?
Well, I had a question for you, actually. You get to ask all the questions. So my question for you is, because you actually used an important word, I thought, that was honoring, honoring God's original plan and the way he caused this to be developed from the beginning. I think that's actually really good. My question is, how do you do that in a way that doesn't eventually descend into legalism? I feel like I've been parts of Christian environments where people, they're Christians, and this is not so much. This is sometimes true of the law, but it's sometimes true of just, ethical principles or drinking beer. It's like, oh, you've got the freedom to drink beer, but the real Christians don't drink beer.
That's right.
And you're totally free to be a Gentile, but the real Christians celebrate Sukkot.
Right.
And this, what I'm saying? And so, and part of me just is like, I don't own a gun, but part of me like feels like going, where's my gun? Because I'm going to shoot that person, because I can't, I instinctively rebel again. And somebody starts saying, you really should. And part of that's just my rebellious nature. But my question to you is, how do you tell me more about inculcating the love of God and the respect for his plan in a way that is not legalistic, please?
Yeah, it's very difficult, because you made the point that our hearts are religious. And so even if one person were to keep the Sabbath or Sukkot for purely, honoring reasons, the next person is going to do it for religious. It's like we have to, first of all, just admit that that's an incurable trajectory that we have to constantly confront all the time. And so like, I don't think I almost never talk about the Sabbath without trying to quote from Colossians 2, where Paul says so overtly, like, these things are a shadow. Let no one judge you with regards to a new moon festival or a Sabbath or a holy day. Like, that's such a, like, to me, him saying that is such a radical, challenge to legalism, to say, let no one, it's exactly what you just said. Like, I want to grab a gun. It's like, don't let that guy do that. Like, stop him. Like,
right.
Christians should stop people who are judging them for not keeping. This is what Paul says. Stop people who judge you for not keeping the Sabbath. Stop people who are judging you for not keeping a festival. How else are you going to stop this religious, sort of instinct that we have towards legalism? So yeah, I completely think that I don't think there's any solution to what you're describing, other than to say that we have to highly sensitize each other to that problem. And so when you're the other way that I think about it is, traditions are all, there's commands and traditions are always in that wisdom category that Ryan was describing. And wisdom looks different depending on your family of origin, where you live. Do you keep Sabbath on a Sunday or a Saturday? I keep it on a Saturday. Why do I keep it on a Saturday? Primarily, I enjoy that tradition because I think in our context as a family, it's more wise to do it on that day. But I look at other families, I'm like, it's wise for them to keep it on Sunday. It's wise for them to keep it on Monday. It's wise for them to ignore that command for now, for all kinds of reasons. I believe all of that is possible. And who am I to say, like, these are traditions. And so it's a wisdom question, and wisdom questions, they depend on circumstances, and they're not moral. And I think that what really incites the legalistic spirit is the desire to make everything a moral issue. And that's why I love what Ryan said. It's not like honoring itself is really not a moral issue until it gets into the realm of direct dishonoring. Like there's a huge amount of spectrum of how to honor people, so you might honor them by, contributing money to this thing, or by saying something nice or making a compliment. But as soon as you make it moral, you're like, here are the 5 things you have to do to honor me. And if you don't do all 5 in this order, then you're morally a bad person. And I think that we have to stop that kind of judgment. And especially on this side of the cross, Paul's whole point was these are shadows of things to come. The fullness is Christ. In other words, because we're in the gospel, all of these traditions themselves were pointers. And so pointers are really, really fun to enjoy, especially for the reasons Ryan described, as far as like, I want to be rooted in something that doesn't topple over every generation, because I'm about to have a grandchild and I want them to experience like the richness of the history of our family and our faith, but I think that's the desire that I want to just, really highlight, John. I think you're 100% right. Like this is like, but I also want to push some pressure on the other side and say, to be so afraid of legalism that you don't initiate traditions is problematic for other reasons. And so we have to initiate traditions, but we need to admit constantly that these are circumstantial, these are wisdom issues, and we're not talking about morality. So anybody want to say something to sort of sum this up before we transition? Did we put a bow on that sucker?
I think so.
You
A really
think
nice
so?
one.
Okay. Well, this is really helpful, guys. Yeah, I'm sure people listening to this have a lot of things that we didn't cover, but I really appreciate you guys coming on this today. I love getting just to process these things in this way. It's so beneficial for me, and I appreciate you guys being willing to come on here. So thanks so much for doing this with me.
Yeah, thank you for the invite.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jeremy.